Welcome to the George Washington Cold War Channel. I am GWCW. With me in the studio is Professor Nan Kim at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Welcome to the studio.
Thank you.
And can you tell us about your book a little bit to begin with?
Sure. I thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. My book was published last November. It's Memory, Reconciliation, and Reunions in South Korea, Crossing the Divide. And the book is about, it focuses on the meetings between families who were separated between North and South. I focus on the period right after the June Summit, historic June Summit in 2000. And it was these initial rounds of separated family meetings took place that August, and August 15th on Liberation Day. And so that was those series of meetings really were the first major outcome of the June Summit meeting. And it was one where the two families, the two sides were discovering for the first time the survival, really, of people who had disappeared during the war.
And this is after 50 years of no contact whatsoever, correct?
That's right.
So can you tell us about what the families must have felt when they were actually able to see their loved ones and discover who survived, who went missing and such?
Right. It was a very intense scene. I was able to do field work in Seoul, the reunions that occurred the first three rounds. And the initial encounters were very emotional. Each of the family members had been accompanied by someone from the north,
yes.
And so they guided them to the tables, and the initial scenes, as the newspapers characterized it after a sea of tears, there was before those initial meetings, there had been measures to confirm who survived and who was still traceable. And it was actually at that point when the North and South exchanged lists that there had been also another very sort of dramatic scene when I was able to do field work at the South Korean Red Cross headquarters. Because this was really the moment when they saw the applications that were sent from the North. There was a little photograph. It had been photocopied many times, so it was quite blurry. But a number of people really had to see some evidence and then realized that their family member, who in many cases were given up for dead, mourned for decades, had been alive all this time in North Korea. So that was also made it so much more complex when so much more. That made it much more fraught. That made it much more fraught for them to meet after all this time with so many questions, and it was all taking place on national, international television, on broadcast.
Was it all just raw emotions throughout, or were there some kind of happy moments during the reunion as well?
Well, at this period of time, we have to remember that this was really the initial events following the June Summit, and at the time there was really a sense that the two Koreas, the reunification of the two Koreas was inevitable, and so this was it was framed as a very important moment in terms of the reconciliation between the two sides. So although there was this, as you said, these scenes of searing emotion in their initial meetings, there were also times when, following those initial moments, they caught up as family members, exchanged photographs, were able to tell stories about the war and the circumstances, being able to resolve some of these mysteries of how they, in many cases, disappeared.
So now let's look at the bigger picture. How would you say the geopolitics of the Cold War impacted the lives of those families who were able to reunite?
A very important question. Of course, the families who were participating in these reunions were those who had been separated during the chaos of the war. Particularly, this is the a period of major hostilities from June of 1950 until July 1953 as far as the periodization of the Cold War. And so, but it was in the initial, especially initial months, when there was a lot of movement of populations, that's the time at which many people had moved to different parts of the peninsula, not expecting that there would be a permanent division between the two. So these temporary migrations turned into indefinite exile. So, but as far as the Korean War, in terms of the conclusion, there had been an attempt to try to return civilians from one side to another. There was a committee to assist displaced civilians, and that they had met in the end of 1953. But this was, we recall, after negotiations had bogged down earlier, prior to the signing of the armistice agreement. So the committee that was charged with helping to return the civilians had a very short period that they resolved that the civilians would be exchanged at the beginning of March of 1954, meaning they only had this short time, and the committee was comprised of 4 field officers to undertake this enormous task. If you think that there were an estimated 1.7 million from the South Korean side who had been on the opposite, who are North Koreans, who those who were from the northern part of the peninsula were on the southern side, and then estimated 200 to 300,000 South Koreans who were on the northern side.
So how does a Korean family reunion compare to the experiences of the families that were divided by the Cold War in other parts of the world?
So in Korea, if you compare the reunions in North and South Korea with reunions that took place, let's say in Germany, divided Germany, or between families in Hong Kong and China, divided between Hong Kong and China, the major difference is that these families in Korea had no contact at all, so that they, after decades of no
interaction whatsoever.
No interaction whatsoever, exactly. In the case of Germany or in families divided between Hong Kong and China, they had been able to exchange letters or be in contact with one another. And even those are also very emotional meetings. It's an entirely different set of circumstances in Korea. Part of this is really a reflection of the unended nature of the Korean War, where there was an armistice signed, which was intended to be temporary. There has never been the signing of a formal peace treaty. Part of this is also stemming from the fact that the case of Korean division is regarded as the most extreme among the Cold War divisions. And this is particularly because North Korea, starting around 1960, had started a series of, or had implemented a series of self-isolation policies, and where they cut off all contact, even with other communist nations as well. And so this partly stemmed from their vulnerability as being one half of the divided nation.
Last but not least, why do you think the divided families have become such a powerful symbol of Korea's suffering?
In terms of Korea's division, on both sides of the divide, the separated families are really iconic figures of that national division. And in the case of these particular reunions, the fact that those who returned, this was not a reunion of families who had been able to contact each other. In a sense, this was a return from the dead in many ways. And so the title of my book is also talking about not only this crossing of the territorial boundary, but really a passage from a social death and back to being able to reconnect with family. But that also signified how there were countless deaths that could not be accounted for. There are a range of estimates in terms of the number of people killed during the Korean War, as high as 4 million people. But the consensus among all of the different estimates is that there was more than half were civilians. And so the fact that there were so many civilians who died in the war, but then also following in the post-war period, because of the consolidation of these Cold War, opposing Cold War states, you really had a kind of suppression of the stories of ordinary people and how they had been traumatized by this massive devastation, catastrophic losses of the Korean War.
All right, thank you so much for being here today. And that was Professor Nan Kim at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee.
Thank you.